Welcome to another episode of This Is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast, Season 4, Episode 43. Your safe space to discuss sports, politics, social issues, and even religion, where we will take it all very seriously, but not too seriously. The white hat went up against the black hat, the good guys versus the bad guys, and unfortunately the bad guys prevailed. An autopsy of the 2024 New York Metropolitans baseball season. I plan to have 3 different segments on this podcast, and because I ran my mouth about the Mets for so long, I will save that content for later. Did I get to gush about Mark Vientos becoming one of the Mets' best hitters and a legitimate all-star at third base? Did I get to talk about Kevin Marte coming back from injury and having one of the best seasons he's had in the last 5, not only in right field, but at the plate for the Mets? Did I get to talk about Francisco Alvarez coming into his own, getting so many timely hits as catcher for the New York Mets, a guy that they've stuck with for the last 2 seasons? No, I didn't. But there's plenty of other stuff to gush about, and I do so for the next 30 minutes. So buckle up, dear listener. Thank you all, those loyal listeners, and if you're new to the podcast, please like, subscribe, thumbs up, 5-star, write a review, send to friends and enemies far and wide. Yes, This Is Why I Don't Vote is on Patreon. You will notice that the content is advertisement free. Let's keep it that way. So give me money so I don't have to beg and become a corporate shill to pay for this podcast.
Act 1. Autopsy of the 2024 New York Metropolitans.
We're all adults. We realize that the good guys don't always win. The 2024 New York Metropolitans fall to the Los Angeles Dodgers in 6 games. The bullpen just could not hold up under the onslaught of the Dodgers. And frankly, one of the Achilles heels of the New York Mets was their starting pitching not being able to pitch well into games at the beginning of the season. Their inability to pitch well into games at the beginning of the 2024 season led to overwork of a bullpen that wasn't on paper and, unfortunately, in practice, that impressive. So, the Mets were bad. The Mets gave up way too many runs. Starting pitchers did not pitch well enough into games to preserve the bullpen. The bullpen wasn't that good. The Mets would give up a lot of runs. If they scored a lot of runs, they gave up more. And to the extent that their pitching staff ever had a good game, they couldn't score runs. Watching those games against the Dodgers reminded me of watching the Mets at the beginning of the season and being disgusted. The Mets don't have a lot of pitchers that can get a swing and a miss. They have pitchers that pitch on the outside of the plate. They are inducing hitters to swing. Aggressive hitters play right into that. Many of today's hitters are so aggressive that the Mets had a lot of success in the latter half of the season and into the playoffs with that pitching staff. That's a long way for me to say that when the Mets lost to the Dodgers, it was reminiscent of that Mets team that I remember not being very good at the beginning of the season, and I wasn't but so disappointed recognizing that this team, this 2024 New York Metropolitans team, as it's constructed, did as well as it probably could have in a magical season. An autopsy of the 2024 New York Mets starts with this team being awful and then good, and then awful for the first 2 months of the season. It was a roller coaster ride. They played poorly, they played well, they played poorly, they played well. The veneer of the Mets being a good baseball team was completely destroyed in the month of May as they went 9-19. Starting pitching, as I just mentioned, could not pitch well into games. The bullpen was atrocious, and the bats went cold. It was almost as if these pitching woes mentally affected the outlook of the hitters, and the Mets couldn't score any runs, and the Mets couldn't stop anybody from scoring runs. Then, that fateful day, May 29th, 2024, Jose Lopez comes into the game as a reliever that had been heavily relied upon by the Mets in the bullpen So much so that he was probably being overused, as were many of the other relievers, and they weren't enjoying any success. These relievers were booed. I booed them. These relievers were often put into very bad situations early on in games, in the fourth and the fifth and the sixth inning, after the starting pitcher could not get through the heart of another team's lineup for a second time. Not for a third time, but for a second time. These relievers would have to come in. They're put in bad positions, and they didn't pitch well. Jorge Lopez does not have a solid outing. He leaves the mound after getting the last out, and he throws his glove into the stands. Now, I did a segment contemporaneous to that event happening about this. One of the things that you have to do if you're going to throw your glove into the stands is there's a net there. There's a net that is raised up during the inning to protect people at certain positions on first and third base from foul balls. So he had to throw his glove so intentionally into the crowd that he cleared that net, which he did. That was somewhat of an athletic feat in and of itself, that he was able to throw his glove so high in the air and so far out into the stands that he cleared this net. Of course, he's now front and center in the post-game press conference, and he goes on somewhat of a bilingual tirade. He doesn't speak English that well, and he was talking about the fact that he was one of the worst teammates in all of Major League Baseball, and a lot of people construed what he said as saying that I'm on the worst team in Major League Baseball. The Mets promptly designated him for assignment, which in baseball parlance means they basically released him. All the players are now being asked about the locker room, the clubhouse atmosphere, whether or not everyone's going to be able to get along well enough to have a successful season, whether or not there's animosity between the bullpen, the starting pitching, the position players. It's a mess. At the end of May, the Mets were 22-33. They were 11 games under 500, and there did not seem to be any light at the end of the tunnel. Because I am a genius, I called for the breakup of this team. I called for any asset that the Mets had to be evaluated on the trade market to see what kind of draft picks we could get or what we could get in return, even from active players in the major leagues, to try to improve what was, it appeared, to be a lost season. The next little piece of news that came out was that the Mets had a player-only meeting, which, if you are a fan of sports, usually means A, your team fucking sucks, B, there is not an accord in that locker room. There is a lot of animosity between players, and it doesn't matter what sport it is. It's usually between the offense and the defense, certain types of position players. There is animosity based on the performance of certain players, and that has to be aired in front of everyone, and people have to either air grievances and have that recognized, or there has to be some sort of collective forgiveness for people that are perceived to be failing the rest of the team, and everyone accepts as much and can move forward. These types of meetings rarely ever work. This is like the owner coming out and saying that the general manager or the manager or the coach of a team is secure in their job while the team is underperforming. That's almost the death knell of that person's tenure in that position. When you have to assure people that you're not going to fire someone, you very likely are probably going to fire someone. The Mets have this players-only meeting. It's public that the Mets have had this players-only meeting, and then they go on and they win their next series. They win 2 out of 3 of their next games. Well, isn't that nice? I read the New York Rags. I read the scuttlebutt on the Twitters and the Instagrams, and no one was that impressed. No one thought this is the turnaround. This team is going to surge in July and August. And yet, they played better in June, and what happened? They started to surge in July and August. What was the big turnaround? For me, it was the fact that the starting pitching started to take accountability for the fact that they weren't getting through but maybe 4 or 5 innings, and they started pitching well into the game. They were giving 6, 7, sometimes 8 innings worth of work. This took stress off of the bullpen, and the offense collectively had that breath of fresh air. There was that exhale, that release, and there wasn't so much pressure to go out and have to score 11 runs to win a baseball game. And in my mind, part of that was the experience on the team. You had players like Iglesias and Martinez. These guys had been around the league for a while, and they started to play as well as they've played in years, if not, in Iglesias' case, as well as he's ever played in his entire career. Brandon Nimmo, lifelong Met, starts to hit. Jeff McNeil starts to hit. But the big turnaround for a Mets fan was the fact that Francisco Lindor really embraced not only his hitting, but his fielding, and started to become more of a leader on that team, a leader that the Mets and the Mets fan base expected him to be when they traded for him from Cleveland back in 2000, I think it was 2021. 2020. They traded for him in 2020. So he'd been on the Mets team for 4 seasons, and he had never really looked like the guy that the Mets saw in Cleveland. He had either streaks where his defense wasn't as good as it should have been, but he had longer streaks where he just didn't hit that well. Carlos Mendoza, the Mets manager, saw something and decided to put him in the leadoff spot. And that changed everything for the New York Metropolitans in the year of our Lord 2024. With Lindor leading off, the offense just exploded. And I don't know if that responsibility bled over into his fielding and his presence on the field and his presence in the dugout and in the locker room, the clubhouse. Lindor became a presence on the field, off the field. He began to endear himself to Mets fans as he had not up and until that point. With Lindor leading off, with all of these veterans providing somewhat of a calming influence on a team that was 11 games under 500, the Mets began to surge. I knew something was going on in the Mets series when they played Houston, and Houston was playing really well at the time. They were surging in their own right. They started out slow this season, and they were on a streak. So were the Mets. So I thought, okay, this is going to be a good test as to whether or not the Mets are just beating up on the little sisters of the poor, beating the teams, granted, that they're supposed to beat because they consider themselves one of the contenders to get into the playoffs, or is this just a Mets team that was playing a little bit above their heads against poor competition? Now they're going to play a good team and they're going to get their asses kicked. Well, the Mets ended up losing 2 out of 3 of those games to Houston. And although that sounds bad, they were in every game, and that series was in Houston. They were leading in one of those games and ended up losing in the 9th inning. Again, the bullpen, I'm looking at you, Edwin Diaz, having its ups and downs. Let's then transition very quickly to one Edwin Diaz, who helped encourage me to have at least 20 to 30% more gray hair come in over the course of the last 3 months than I had prior. That's the thing about Diaz. He's one of the most electric closers in the game when he has his control. Does he always have his control? No, he doesn't. And what's wild about it is, it's almost as if when he recognizes that he doesn't have his control, he just says, fuck it. He just continues to throw the same way that he's been throwing. It's almost like he's resigned himself to the fact that if these guys don't swing and miss at bad pitches, or at least hit a pitch on the field or up in the air so that I can get outs, I'm just not going to get the outs. I witnessed this firsthand here in Arizona when the Mets came to visit the Diamondbacks, and because of the weakness of the Mets bullpen, Mendoza pulled a guy that the Mets had traded for before the trade deadline, Phil Matone, who wasn't having a terrible season but wasn't having a great season. I think the Mets thought that they could bring him in, they could shore up their own bullpen and perhaps coach him up, get him back to pitching as he had in the past couple of seasons. Matone does not get the outs that he needs to. Mendoza goes to Edwin Diaz and I watch him walk the bases loaded and then have Corbin Carroll hit a grand slam after the Mets had come back in that game, it was just frustrating. It's that resigned frustration that we have as sports fans when we see something happening and we're like, this doesn't look good. It just doesn't look like it's going to work out. And then it doesn't work out. And you're like, I saw that train wreck from a mile away and I couldn't take my eyes off of it. I'll give credit to Mendoza where credit is due. He stuck with Edwin Diaz. He knew that the Mets weren't going to go anywhere unless they had a lights-out closer, and he needed Edwin Diaz to be that guy. And so he continued to encourage him, and he continued to give him opportunities, even though Diaz let him down time and time again throughout the course of the season. Diaz's overall numbers weren't terrible, but he had a number of blown saves. And that's the thing about closers. We all expect that because that's their job, they're going to come in and close out the game, that they should do so. And it's just not the case. Sometimes they don't have great stuff. Sometimes they're facing the wrong part of the lineup. But Diaz had many opportunities to save games, and he blew them. That's what she said. Couldn't help it. Had to take that opportunity. So here we go into the last 3 weeks of the season, and the New York Metropolitans are now fighting for what are 3 playoff spots with 5 teams. Who are these teams that are fighting for these playoff spots? Well, it's the New York Metropolitans, it's the Atlanta Braves, it's the Arizona Diamondbacks, it's the San Diego Padres. Many people forget this. The Chicago Cubs were right there. If recollection serves, the San Francisco Giants were just starting to fade. Speaking of fade, there go the Cubs within a week, and the Arizona Diamondbacks curiously stop winning baseball games. So then you get into the last couple of weeks, the last week, the Braves felt like they were secure in their spot, and so did the Arizona Diamondbacks. Well, both of them, the Arizona Diamondbacks in particular, start to drop games here and there. The New York Metropolitans, for their part, go 25-5 leading up to that last week of the 2024 Major League Baseball season. Lo and behold, the New York Metropolitans have a 2-game lead over the Atlanta Braves in that last week of the season. What happens, of course? The Mets have to go to Milwaukee, where they have not played well, and they have not played well recently, and unfortunately, they had not played well in a while. So you have a team that's going to a stadium they haven't played well at. They don't have a very good record against that team in the 2024 season and the 2023 season. And frankly, they hadn't played well in Milwaukee for like 3 or 4 seasons. And now they need to win all of the games that they are playing in order to make sure they don't have to worry about a series they have against the Atlanta Braves in Atlanta to end the season. Well, of course, what happens? The Mets lose 2 out of 3 of those baseball games. Now they have a series to sweat against the Atlanta Braves. They lose the first game, and games 2 and 3 are rained out because of the hurricane. Because fate said so, the New York Metropolitans and the Atlanta Braves and the Arizona Diamondbacks are all tied at the end of the season for 2 playoff spots, and the Mets and the Braves have a make-up doubleheader to play on Monday after the season ends in order to determine which 2 out of those 3 teams is going to the playoffs. Either team sweeps, the team that sweeps is in, Arizona Diamondbacks are in. If they split, it's those 2 teams, the Mets and the Braves in, Arizona Diamondbacks are out. And a game for the ages, game 1 of the doubleheader, Mets and Braves, where the Mets didn't participate in the game until the 8th inning. The Mets come back and take the lead with a 6-run 8th inning. Everyone thinks it's over. Mendoza goes to Diaz to get these crucial outs, and Diaz blows it. Diaz and the rest of the bullpen give up the lead. The Mets are down now 1 going into the top of the 9th inning with Atlanta's closer coming in, who has had a very good season. In a story that will make my penis hard for the next 10 years, Francisco Lindor comes up with one man on to hit a 2-run home run to take the lead, and in a brilliant move of both managerial strategy and, frankly, in a team-building effort, a demonstration that the manager truly does trust his people, Mendoza allows Diaz to come back in to close the game after he had just blown the save. Although there were additional dramatics, of course, Diaz can't just get 3 outs. He's got to walk somebody. There's got to be a hit. Atlanta was threatening again, but he does get the final out, and the Mets are going to the playoffs. Where do the Mets get to go? They get to go to Milwaukee, the place I just told you that they lost 2 of 3 games in the week prior, and they haven't played well recently being the 2024 season or maybe the 2023 season. And if you keep scrolling back on those stats, doesn't look like they played very well there in 2022 or 2021 or 2020. So congratulations, you made the playoffs. Unfortunately, you're going to go to a place that you haven't played well for a long time. Mets win Game 1. Milwaukee wins Game 2. Pivotal Game 3. The rubber match, the deciding game to determine who is going to go and play the Phillies. And the Mets are down. And the Mets are down 2-0. And the Mets are down 2-0 in the top of the 9th inning. And the Mets are down to their last out. In an event that will make my dick hard for the next 10 years, Pete Alonso hits a 3-run home run at the top of the 9th inning to take a 3-2 lead in Milwaukee. And God bless you, Edwin Diaz. Diaz comes in, gets the 3 outs. The Mets are off to Philadelphia. Here's the thing about the New York Metropolitans and the Philadelphia Phillies. These teams obviously know each other very well because they are in the same division. They play each other a considerable number of times over the course of a season, and they have played each other a considerable number of times as Philadelphia has risen, as they've become great over the course of the last 3 seasons. The thing about the Philadelphia Phillies hitters is they are very, very aggressive, and that plays right into the hands of the New York Mets pitching staff. The Mets don't have a lot of swing and miss pitchers. They have guys that play on the corners. They have guys that are going to throw you pitches that look like strikes but aren't strikes, and they are hoping that you're going to have so little plate discipline that you're going to swing at pitches that are out of the strike zone. And that's exactly what the Philadelphia Phillies hitters did. As much as the Mets offense played well against the Phillies, and they did, Wheeler was the only one that gave them a ton of trouble, and they were still able to win that game after Wheeler left the game. The Mets pitching staff, their starting pitchers in particular, had very effective outings against the Philadelphia Phillies. World Series hopefuls, out. The New York Metropolitans defeat the Philadelphia Phillies in 6 games, and off to LA they go. And that's where the story ends. All fairy tales have an ending, and this one ended in Los Angeles because the Los Angeles Dodgers hitters, as much as it pains me to say it, 3 MVPs, as my buddy Brian likes to point out. You have 3 guys in the lineup that have won the Most Valuable Player award. They are disciplined hitters. They don't swing at a lot of pitches that are out of the strike zone. And I literally went over this a couple of times in my notes, and I forgot to mention it. So I'm going to mention it now. What happens when a starting lineup throws a lot of pitches that are either right at the edge of the strike zone or they look like strikes but they're out of the strike zone? They're going to walk a lot of guys. And over the course of a season, that accounts for a lot of additional pitches thrown, and it accounts for a lot of those additional runs given up because you're constantly facing guys on base. That can test the mettle of any pitching staff. Now, on the one hand, the Mets were very comfortable with guys on base because their pitchers, both their starting pitchers and their bullpen pitchers, they walk a lot of guys. So the Mets defense, the Mets pitchers, they're comfortable with guys on base. They're comfortable pitching out of the stretch because they've faced it all season. The downside, of course, is when you have all those runners on base, you have to be perfect. You have to be perfect in the field. You have to be perfect behind the plate. Any passed ball, any kind of error, it's going to cost you runs. And against the Dodgers, what happened? It cost the Mets runs. The Mets pitchers could not get swing and miss strikeouts. The Mets pitchers walked a lot of batters who were very patient, who realized these guys are not going to throw us a lot of strikes. And when the Mets pitchers had the opportunity, they just didn't challenge the Dodgers hitters. And I should probably be clear about that type of statement. The Mets had counts where they could probably challenge the Dodgers hitters, and they did not do so. They got themselves into bad counts where it was dangerous to challenge the Dodgers hitters, and to the extent that they did, they got hammered. Some disgustingly long home runs. I have received numerous texts, many from the people who listen to this podcast, congratulating me on the 2024 baseball season, the New York Metropolitans' success. And a lot of people are asking me, are they going to be able to keep the team together? And what's interesting is that as much as I love this team was one of the most likable New York Metropolitans teams I can remember in years. In years. It is not a team that's built for long-term success. You had someone like Jose Iglesias having perhaps his best season as a major leaguer, and he's 35 years old. Are you going to pay him a 2 or 3 year contract based on stats that are 1 year old, that you've got basically 1 year worth of that kind of quality, anticipating that it's going to continue? There's a bunch of other key contributors like Harrison Bader, Jesse Winker. I'm not sure if they're going to be able to keep all of them or if they want to keep all of them. If the expectation is that these guys are all going to have better seasons next year than they did this year. Pete Alonso's a free agent. JD Martinez can walk. Sean Manaea has an opt-out clause, which he's no doubt going to exercise. So there's a lot of key pieces that the Mets are going to have the opportunity to bring back, but they may look on the free agent market and see another asset. They may see somebody who they think is more worth that type of money or is younger. I don't know. There's a lot of uncertainty about what the Mets are going to look like in 2025. I'd love for them to bring Pete Alonso back. I feel like that he's warranted a contract that would keep him a New York Metropolitan for at least the next 4 or 5 seasons. Looking at his stats, it's hard to justify a max contract for him. He did not have a great batting average. His slugging percentage went up and down. And granted, look, the batting average for a slugger is not the most indicative metric of whether or not they provide value to the team. Slugging percentage, OPS being more important. Alonso had very cold streaks throughout the course of the season, even when the Mets were surging. Does his postseason play warrant a $250 million contract for 4 years? I don't know. We'll see what the free agent market. One of the writers that I like was speculating that the Mets are going to allow other teams to make offers to Pete Alonso, and the Mets will match that offer and see what Alonso wants to do. Does he want to stay in New York, or does he want to explore another opportunity? If the money's all the same, it's almost testing Alonso's loyalty whether or not he does want to stay with the Mets. Shit, I wanted this piece to be no longer than 15 minutes. Of course, I'm going to run my mouth when it's talking about the New York Metropolitans for close to 30 minutes. I'll wrap it up here. Were they the Miracle Mets of 1969? No, they were not. They were not the Amazings of even the early 2000s. But what they were was one of the most likable New York Metropolitans teams that I can remember, at least in the last 15 years, and they had a number of iconic moments in baseball. This playoff run that the Mets made is going to be remembered not only in New York, but in Atlanta, but in Milwaukee and in Philadelphia for decades to come. And although metaphorically and not physically, come I did as these home runs were hit, as these late game heroics unfolded. Thank you, 2024 New York Metropolitans, for reminding me that there's a reason why we root for these teams, why we have hope, that sometimes, once in a blue moon, it will actually pay off. This is Why Don't Vote, a podcast.